Continental Army was formed after the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War by the colonies that became the United States of America. Established by a resolution of the Continental Congress on June 14, 1775, it was created to coordinate the military efforts of the 13 colonies in their revolt against the rule of Great Britain. The Continental Army was supplemented by local militias and other troops that remained under control of the individual states. General George Washington was the commander-in-chief of the army throughout the war. Most of the Continental Army was disbanded in 1783 after the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The 1st and 2nd Regiments went on to form the nucleus of the Legion of the United States in 1792 under General Anthony Wayne. This became the foundation of the United States Army in 1796. Creation: the Continental Army consisted of soldiers from all 13 colonies, and after 1776, from all 13 states. When the American Revolutionary War began at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the colonial revolutionaries did not have an army. Previously, each colony had relied upon the militia, made up of part-time citizen soldiers, for local defense, or the raising of temporary provincial regiments during specific crises such as the French and Indian War. As tensions with Great Britain increased in the years leading up to the war, colonists began to reform their militia in preparation for the potential conflict. Training of militiamen increased after the passage of the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Colonists such as Richard Henry Lee proposed creating a national militia force, but the First Continental Congress rejected the idea. The minimum enlistment age was 16 years of age, or 15 with parental consent. On April 23, 1775, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress authorized the raising of a colonial army consisting of 26 company regiments, followed shortly by similar but smaller forces raised by New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. On June 14, 1775, the Second Continental Congress decided to proceed with the establishment of a Continental Army for purposes of common defense, adopting the forces already in place outside Boston and New York. It also raised the first 10 companies of Continental troops on a one-year enlistment, riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware and Virginia to be used as light infantry, who later became the 1st Continental Regiment in 1776. On June 15, the Congress elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief by unanimous vote. He accepted and served throughout the war without any compensation except for reimbursement of expenses. 4 major generals and 8 brigadier generals were appointed in the course of a few days. Pomeroy declined and the position was left unfilled. As the Continental Congress increasingly adopted the responsibilities and posture of a legislature for a sovereign state, the role of the Continental Army was the subject of considerable debate. There was a general aversion to maintaining a standing army among the Americans. But, on the other hand, the requirements of the war against the British required the discipline and organization of a modern military. As a result, the army went through several distinct phases, characterized by official dissolution and reorganization of units. Soldiers in the Continental Army were citizens who had volunteered to serve in the army, and at various times during the war, standard enlistment periods lasted from 1 to 3 years. Early in the war, the enlistment periods were short, as the Continental Congress feared the possibility of the Continental Army evolving into a permanent army. The army never reached over 17,000 men. Turnover was a constant problem, particularly in the winter of 1776-77, and longer enlistments were approved. Broadly speaking, Continental forces consisted of several successive armies, or establishments: the Continental Army of 1775, comprising the initial New England Army, organized by Washington into 3 divisions, 6 brigades, and 38 regiments. Major General Philip Schuyler's 10 regiments in New York was sent to invade Canada. The Continental Army of 1776, reorganized after the initial enlistment period of the soldiers in the 1775 Army had expired. Washington had submitted recommendations to the Continental Congress almost immediately after he had accepted the position of Commander-in-Chief, but these took time to consider and implement. Despite attempts to broaden the recruiting base beyond New England, The 1776 Army remained skewed towards the northeast both in terms of its composition and geographical focus. This army consisted of 36 regiments, most standardized to a single battalion of 768 men strong formed into 8 companies, with a rank-and-file strength of 640. The Continental Army of 1777-80 was a result of several critical reforms and political decisions that came about when it was apparent that the British were sending massive forces to put an end to the American Revolution. The Continental Congress passed the 88 Battalion Resolve, ordering each state to contribute 1 battalion regiments in proportion to their population, and Washington was subsequently given authority to raise an additional 16 battalions. Also, enlistment terms were extended to 3 years or the length of the war to avoid the year-end crises that depleted forces. The Continental Army of 1781-82 saw the greatest crisis on the American side in the war. Congress was bankrupt, making it very difficult to replenish the soldiers whose 3-year terms had expired. Popular support for the war was at its all-time low, and Washington had to put down mutinies both in the Pennsylvania line and New Jersey line. Congress voted to cut funding for the Army, but Washington managed nevertheless to secure important strategic victories. The Continental Army of 1783-84 was succeeded by the United States Army, which persists to this day. As peace was closed with the British, most of the regiments were disbanded in an orderly fashion, though several had already been diminished. In addition to the Continental Army regulars, local militia units, raised and funded by individual colonies states, participated in battles throughout the war. Sometimes, the militia units operated independently of the Continental Army, but often local militias were called out to support and augment the Continental Army regulars during campaigns. The financial responsibility for providing pay, food, shelter, clothing, arms, and other equipment to specific units was assigned to states as part of the establishment of these units. States differed in how well they lived up to these obligations. There were constant funding issues and morale problems as the war continued. This led to the Army offering low pay, often rotten food, hard work, cold, heat, poor clothing and shelter, harsh discipline, and a high chance of becoming a casualty. Operations. At the time of the Siege of Boston, the Continental Army at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in June 1775, is estimated to have numbered from 14,000 to 16,000 men from New England. Until Washington's arrival, it remained under the command of Artemas Ward, while John Thomas acted as executive officer and Richard Grodley commanded the artillery corps and was chief engineer. The British force in Boston was increasing by fresh arrivals. It numbered then about 10,000 men. Major Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne had arrived late in May and joined General Gage in forming and executing plans for dispersing the rebels. Feeling strong with these veteran officers and soldiers around in and the presence of several ships of war under Admiral Graves the governor issued a proclamation, declaring martial law, branding the entire Continental Army and supporters as rebels, and parasites of the Constitution. Amnesty was offered to those who gave up their allegiance to the Continental Army and Congress in favor of the British authorities, though Samuel Adams and John Hancock were still wanted for high treason. This proclamation only served to strengthen the resolve of the Congress and Army. After the British evacuation of Boston, the Continental Army relocated to New York. For the next 5 years, the main bodies of the Continental and British armies campaigned against one another in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. These campaigns included the notable battles of Trenton, Princeton, Brandywine, Germantown, and Morristown, among many others. The Continental Army was racially integrated, a condition the United States Army would not see again until the Korean War. African American slaves were promised freedom in exchange for military service in New England, and made up 1/5 of the Northern Continental Army. Throughout its existence, the Army was troubled by poor logistics, inadequate training, short-term enlistments, interstate rivalries, and Congress's inability to compel the states to provide food, money or supplies. In the beginning, soldiers enlisted for a year, largely motivated by patriotism. But as the war dragged on, bounties and other incentives became more commonplace. Two major mutinies late in the war drastically diminished the reliability of two of the main units, and there were constant discipline problems. The Army increased its effectiveness and success rate through a series of trials and errors, often at great human cost. General Washington and other distinguished officers were instrumental leaders in preserving unity, learning and adapting, and ensuring discipline throughout the 8 years of war. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, with the addition of Baron von Steuben, of Prussian origin, the training and discipline of the Continental Army began to vastly improve. Washington always viewed the Army as a temporary measure and strove to maintain civilian control of the military, as did the Continental Congress, though there were minor disagreements about how this was carried out. Near the end of the war, the Continental Army was augmented by a French expeditionary force and a squadron of the French Navy, and in the late summer of 1781 the main body of the Army travelled south to Virginia to rendezvous with the French West Indies fleet under Admiral Comte de Grasse. This resulted in the Siege of Yorktown, the decisive Battle of the Chesapeake, and the surrender of the British Southern Army. This essentially marked the end of the land war in America, although the Continental Army returned to blockade the British Northern Army in New York until the peace treaty went into effect 2 years later, and battles took place elsewhere between British forces and those of France and its allies. Demobilization. A small residual force remained at West Point and some frontier outposts until Congress created the United States Army by their resolution of June 3, 1784. Planning for the transition to a peacetime force had begun in April 1783 at the request of a congressional committee chaired by Alexander Hamilton. The Commander-in-Chief discussed the problem with key officers before submitting the Army's official views on May 2. Significantly, there was a broad consensus of the basic framework among the officers. Washington's proposal called for 4 components: a small regular army, a uniformly trained and organized militia, a system of arsenals, and a military academy to train the Army's artillery and engineer officers. He wanted 4 infantry regiments, each assigned to a specific sector of the frontier, plus an artillery regiment. His proposed regimental organizations followed Continental Army patterns but had a provision for increased strength in the event of war. Washington expected the militia primarily to provide security for the country at the start of a war until the regular army could expand the same role it had carried out in 1775 and 1776. Steuben and Duportail submitted their own proposals to Congress for consideration. Although Congress declined on May 12 to make a decision on the peace establishment, it did address the need for some troops to remain on duty until the British evacuated New York City and several frontier posts. The delegates told Washington to use men enlisted for fixed terms as temporary garrisons. A detachment of those men from West Point reoccupied New York without incident on November 25. When Steuben's effort in July to negotiate a transfer of frontier forts with Major General Frederick Haldimand collapsed, however, the British maintained control over them, as they would into the 1790s. That failure and the realization that most of the remaining infantrymen's enlistments were due to expire by June 1784 led Washington to order Knox, his choice as the commander of the peacetime army, to discharge all but 500 infantry and 100 artillerymen before winter set in. The former regrouped as Jackson's Continental Regiment under Colonel Henry Jackson of Massachusetts. The single artillery company, New Yorkers under John Doughty, came from remnants of the 2nd Continental Artillery Regiment. Congress issued a proclamation on October 18, 1783 which approved Washington's reductions. On November 2 Washington then released his farewell order to the Philadelphia newspapers for nationwide distribution to the furloughed men. In the message he thanked the officers and men for their assistance and reminded them that the singular interpositions of Providence in our feeble condition were such, as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving. While the unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States, through almost every possible suffering and discouragement for the space of 8 long years, was little short of a standing miracle. Washington believed that the blending of persons from every colony into one patriotic band of brothers had been a major accomplishment, and he urged the veterans to continue this devotion in civilian life. Washington said farewell to his remaining officers on December 4 at Fraunces Tavern in New York City. On December 23 he appeared in Congress, then sitting at Annapolis, and returned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action. And bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission, and take my leave of all the employments of public life. Congress ended the War of American Independence on January 14, 1784 by ratifying the definitive peace treaty that had been signed in Paris on September 3. Congress had again rejected Washington's concept for a peacetime force in October 1783. When moderate delegates then offered an alternative in April 1784 which scaled the projected army down to 900 men in 1 artillery and 3 infantry battalions, Congress rejected it as well, in part because New York feared that men retained from Massachusetts might take sides in a land dispute between the two states. Another proposal to retain 350 men and raise 700 new recruits also failed. On June 2 Congress ordered the discharge of all remaining men except 25 caretakers at Fort Pitt and 55 at West Point. The next day it created a peace establishment acceptable to all interests. The plan required 4 states to raise 700 men for 1 year's service. Congress instructed the Secretary at War to form the troops into 8 infantry and 2 artillery companies. Pennsylvania, with a quota of 260 men, had the power to nominate a lieutenant colonel, who would be the senior officer. New York and Connecticut each were to raise 165 men and nominate a major. The remaining 110 men came from New Jersey. Economy was the watchword of this proposal, for each major served as a company commander, and line officers performed all staff duties except those of chaplain, surgeon, and surgeon's mate. Under Josiah Homer, the first American regiment slowly organized and achieved permanent status as an infantry regiment of the new regular army. The lineage of the first American regiment is carried on by the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment. However, the United States military realized it needed a well-trained standing army following St. Clair's defeat on November 4, 1791, when a force led by General Arthur St. Clair was almost entirely wiped out by the Western Confederacy near Fort Recovery, Ohio. The plans, which were supported by U.S. President George Washington and Henry Knox, Secretary of War, led to the disbandment of the Continental Army and the creation of the Legion of the United States. The command would be based on the 18th-century military works of Henry Bouquet, a professional Swiss soldier who served as a colonel in the British Army, and French Marshal Maurice de Saix. In 1792 Anthony Wayne, a renowned hero of the American Revolutionary War, was encouraged to leave retirement and return to active service as Commander-in-Chief of the Legion with the rank of Major General. The Legion was recruited and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was formed into 4 sub-legions. These were created from elements of the 1st and 2nd Regiments from the Continental Army. These units then became the 1st and 2nd sub-legions. The 3rd and 4th sub-legions were raised from further recruits. From June 1792 to November 1792, the Legion remained cantoned at Fort Lafayette in Pittsburgh. Throughout the winter of 1792-93, existing troops along with new recruits were drilled in military skills, tactics and discipline at Legionville on the banks of the Ohio River near present-day Baden, Pennsylvania. The following spring the newly named Legion of the United States left Legionville for the Northwest Indian War, a struggle between American Indian tribes affiliated with the Western Confederacy in the area south of the Ohio River. The overwhelmingly successful campaign was concluded with a decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers on August 20, 1794. Major General Anthony Wayne applied the techniques of wilderness operations perfected by Sullivan's 1779 expedition against the Iroquois. The training the troops received at Legionville was also seen as an instrumental to this overwhelming victory. Nevertheless, Steuben's Blue Book remained the official manual for the Legion, as well as for the militia of most states, until Winfield Scott in 1835. In 1796, the United States Army was raised following the discontinuation with the Legion of the United States. This coincided with the graduation of the first cadets from United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, which had been established in 1794. Rank Insignia. During the American Revolution, the Continental Army initially wore cockades of various colors as an ad hoc form of rank insignia, as General George Washington wrote. As the Continental Army has unfortunately no uniforms, and consequently many inconveniences must arise from not being able to distinguish the commissioned officers from the privates, it is desired that some badge of distinction be immediately provided. For instance, that the field officers may have red or pink-colored cockades in their hats, the captains yellow or buff, and the subalterns green. Later on in the war, the Continental Army established its own uniform with a black cockade among all ranks and the following insignia: Major battles: Siege of Boston, Battle of Long Island, Battle of Harlem Heights, Battle of Trenton, Battle of Princeton, Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Germantown, Battle of Saratoga, Battle of the Monmouth, Siege of Charleston, Battle of Camden, Battle of Coupens, Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Siege of Yorktown. See also, Departments of the Continental Army, Continental Navy, Pluckham Continental Artillery Cantonment Site, History of the United States Army, Peter Francisco, Revolutionary War Soldier and Hero, Peter Hermreichhaus. Revolutionary War Soldier and Hero, Middlebrook Encampment in Middlebrook, New Jersey, winter of 1776 to 1777 and winter of 1778-779. Valley Forge in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, winter of 1777 to 1778. References, notes. Further reading: Lengel, Edward G. General George Washington, A Military Life. New York, Random House, 2005. ISBN 1-4000-6081-8. Royster, Charles. A Revolutionary People at War, The Continental Army and American Character, 1775–1783. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 1979. ISBN 0-8078-1385-0. Karp, Ewain. To Starve the Army at Pleasure, Continental Army Administration and American Political Culture, 1775–1783. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, 1984. ISBN 0-8078-1587-X. Gillett, Mary C. The Army Medical Department, 1775–1818. Washington, Center of Military History, U.S. Army, 1981. Martin, James Kirby, and Mark Edward Lender. A Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, 1763–1789. 2nd ed. Wheeling, Illinois, Harlan Davidson, 2006. ISBN 0-88295-239-0. Mayer, Holly A. Belonging to the Army, Camp Followers and Community During the American Revolution. Columbia, University of South Carolina Press, 1999. ISBN 1-57003-339-0. ISBN 1-57003-108-8. Risch, Anna. Supplying Washington's Army. Washington, D.C. United States Army Center of Military History. Reference materials. RevWar75.com provides an online cross-referenced index of all surviving orderly books of the Continental Army. Wright, Robert K. The Continental Army. Washington, D.C. United States Army Center of Military History 1983. Available, in part, online from the CMH website, Bibliography of the Continental Army compiled by the United States Army Center of Military History, primary sources Wright, Jr., Robert K. McGregor Jr., Morris J. Resolutions of the Continental Congress adopting the Continental Army and other sources from the Revolution. Soldier Statesman of the Constitution. Washington, D.C., United States Army Center of Military History. CMH Pub 71-25. External links, von Steuben's Continentals.